In many ways, Daniel 7 is a Halloween story. I love it when the lectionary seems to match up perfectly with the calendar that Hallmark is celebrating. Our protagonist, the pseudo-epi-graphical Daniel, has a dream, and it's a Halloween story because his dream is scary. And when we see his point, when we see his perspective, the monsters he envisions can't hurt us. Now, unlike other prophets and prophecies, this isn't a daytime vision. This passage, our reading, situates his vision at night. It's a nighttime dream, or one might even say a nightmare, because the passage that we just heard Bill read for us says Daniel was lying in bed. Just like the content being scary, placing it at night is another nod toward Halloween and the things of darkness, ghosts and vampires and other things that creep and crawl. Now, even though Daniel came about, the book, many centuries after the Babylonian rule, this episode begins in the time of Belshazzar. Now, I realize that doesn't mean much to us. We don't hear those words and instantly get this sense of recognition what Daniel's talking about. We lack the benefit of a living history in which mentioning Babylon invokes a feeling of subjugation. For those who would have heard this story, either originally or as it was evolving, or in other ancient times, they would know when they hear Belshazzar, hearing it would point to one of the worst foreign rulers, and it would bring back dark memories. If we understand that bit of context, we can appreciate more why this is such a scary story. It begins at a frightening time. A bad time for the ancient Israelites, again, might not evoke a feeling in you of the opening lines of a Stephen King novel, but knowing the history, or at least accepting that I'm telling you the truth about it, can help us appreciate this was a really bad time for the ancient Israelites. So, given that context, Daniel goes to sleep, and he begins to dream. And he sees a great sea, an expanse before him. Right now, we're awake, and we're here in the sanctuary, and I hope everyone feels safe. But try to imagine the last bad dream you had, and the feeling that it brought about. Nightmares tend to grab our deepest fears. They work with the subconscious and play upon what's going on in our own heads. And in sleep, we have more trouble saying, this isn't real. I know this isn't real. And as we read this, it sounds like Daniel saw the vastness of the ocean, sort of like being in a helicopter flying low over the waves, seeing them just go on and on. The immensity was overwhelming. It just kept going. And in this hellscape of a primordial sea, 4 huge creatures come up from the depths, break through the surface, and come up before him. Each one is different from the other. The language harkens to the great beasts, Leviathan and Rahab, from the seas of creation in Genesis. What were they? It doesn't matter, because they were scary. When I try to imagine sea beasts, for me, I disassociate these beasts with actual sea creatures. Seeing a northern right whale breach the surface on its way from its breeding ground off the coast of Florida, headed north to feed, that's not scary. To me, that's beautiful. That's a wonder of nature. No, what Daniel is describing in this passage is something horrifying, coming up from the depths and standing before him. Scholars associate these beasts with the great threats facing Israel in ancient times. The Babylonians, the Medians, the Persians, and the Greeks. This is where it comes to your fears and my fears, because it's not about these sea creatures. It's not about some scary movie trying to imagine a beast that would frighten you as you're flying over the ocean. It's saying, what are you afraid of? What is your deepest fear? And now imagine that rising up and standing before you and feeling helpless and powerless, and there's nothing you can do. Daniel, or whoever this ancient character is modeled after, is speaking to the hegemony of power and empire and how God can use power and authority to accomplish God's purposes. God can also usurp this power. But in either case, the goal is the Lord's, and the vision is about accomplishing divine purposes. It's not about invoking God's wrath. It's not about Daniel going to one of the attendants and saying, smite that monster. Daniel 1 through 6, the beginning of the book, before our reading in 7, is a series of stories. Then we get into the visions in the latter part of the book. Daniel is also problematic because part of it's written in Hebrew, part of it's written in Aramaic, and then there are some extant texts that are written in Greek. Those aren't in our Bibles. They come in Bibles that include the Apocrypha or Deuterocanonical books. But that was where Daniel 3:78 came from, back when we did the eco-theology series. And what did the dolphins say? That was one of those verses from the Greek section of Daniel. But in Daniel 1 through 6, there are this series of stories, and each one falls into one of two categories. They're either narratives of interpretation or narratives of deliverance. And seeing this context leading into the vision, we can begin to appreciate what Daniel is seeing and saying in this vision. So in cases of interpretation, they all follow the same format. So in stories of narratives of interpretation, it begins with the king having a dream. The wise people in the court can't do anything about it. The hero emerges and gives the correct interpretation. The hero is rewarded. The king learns that the hero's God, Yahweh, is all-powerful. The other type of story, the stories of deliverance, have a similar format. The king issues an order or a command that the Jews are to worship an idol. And then the heroes, or hero, are discovered disobeying. They refuse to comply and are sentenced to death, but then are delivered. And they're rewarded and their enemies punished. The king learns that the hero's God, Yahweh, is all-powerful. If you remember the other stories, the more famous ones of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, getting thrown into the fiery furnace. There was a children's musical about that years and years ago. It's cool in the furnace. I don't know if anybody else did that. It's interesting to me whenever we see Daniel as a children's story, because it doesn't show that afterwards it's pretty bloody for those the king who discovered were wrong. Since we're not facing a fiery furnace or a lion's den, we can insert our fears. Oh yeah, Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel is delivered. But we're not facing those things. We don't have a king who's trying to make us worship an idol. The idols we worship, we create on our own. But for Daniel's vision, we can insert our own fears here. Right now, it's a scary time. Geopolitical landscape is uncertain. And all of a sudden, after what seemed like the Cold War being gone for a long time, we have that threat of nuclear annihilation back on the table. Or maybe not, I could be totally wrong. What about in our country, if we don't want to go around the world? Or our city? Around the country, attacks on members of Congress have increased 144% between 2017 and 2021. And 2021's the last year that they have accurate numbers. I think today in our prayers, regardless of how you feel politically, we can lift up Nancy Pelosi's husband and the poor misguided soul who attacked him. And as we lift Nancy's husband up, we can join Mitch McConnell, the minority leader in the Senate, in condemning the violence. Both the violence and condemning the violence should be nonpartisan. But what about here locally, when we think about our fears? Here in Charlottesville, there was a shooting in a restaurant in the downtown mall just last week. And then you can insert your own personal fears. See, it's not about the monsters, it's not about a fiery furnace, and it's not about a lion's den. It's about us, and it's about God. The subversive message from Daniel is to not let those fears win. To keep hope alive in the face of all of the things that confront us. To keep believing, keep moving forward, keep trusting. That message turns upside down the societal message of nihilism and giving in to despair. Quiet quitting is just one more symptom of a people who have lost all hope. All hope is not lost. God will raise up a future that will be brighter than the present. Daniel 7:18, the last verse of our reading, says, "The holy ones of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever and ever." Everything around us suggests giving up hope. The news seems to get worse and worse, and even the individual stories get worse and worse. And to that anxiety-ridden nightmare, our main character, Daniel, says, "I don't understand what's going on." Daniel goes to one of the attendants in the dream and says, "Tell me." Later on in Daniel chapter 9, verse 21, that is identified as Gabriel, to say, "Help me, Gabriel." And Gabriel explains that God's going to raise up leaders who will deliver us, and we can look back over the mist through time and see people who have risen to the occasion. Think about before World War II. Dwight Eisenhower was this lieutenant colonel who was working in the Pentagon and working on planning for future, or I don't know if it was in the Pentagon, but he was working, I don't know when it was built, probably not then. But anyway, he was working on planning things. But I don't know if in 1940 we would have wagered that he would be the one to plan and lead the D-Day invasion and the Allied forces' defeat of Germany. But it's not just militaristic and violent victories. Martin Luther King Jr. preached passive resistance. Mother Teresa inspired a generation to be compassionate by loving unlovable people. There are countless examples, and they're not all famous. Sometimes it's grandparents who came to America from Italy. It's people in our lives right now who inspire us, who teach us and show us how to keep hope alive, how to keep things positive, how to keep looking on the bright side of life, how to keep knowing that God is still God and capable of overcoming all we fear. Again and again, when fear is triumphant, when hope seems lost, God comes through. And it's not always the way we expect or imagine. And it's not always through the people we think God ought to be using. If only God would listen to us. That's a joke. Today, pick one fear and give it to God. Pick one person who you can't imagine praying for and lift that person up to God. This only works if you do it with real fears. This only works if you do it with somebody you really cannot imagine lifting up. And it only works if we do it in faith. If we give it in faith to the God who could deliver Daniel from the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the fiery furnace, and you and me from our fears. The God who raised Jesus from the grave, and the God who lives and reigns today. Amen.